So my name is David Muraca. I'm the Director of Archaeology here at Ferry Farm.
My name is Kaktins. I'm the Archaeology Lab Manager here at Ferry Farm.
My name is Allison Ellis. I'm the Manager of Public Programs here for the George Washington Foundation.
Ferry Farm has been a historic site since about the second quarter of the 18th century, when the Washington family moved here from what would become Mount Vernon. George was 6 years old when they arrived, and George spent his formative years here and stayed here until he was 24.
Welcome to the family farm here at Ferry Farm. I am General Washington, your servant.
He learned how to survey here, which then got him his job as the official surveyor for Culpeper County. And then he would eventually kind of move up from there into the ranks of society. We do so much to bring this story to the public spaces, to the people visiting, and to the community. It's a really great part of our jobs here to really educate and bring that story to life.
A lot of the things that happened while he was here shaped him and made him the man that he was going to become. And that is essentially our story at Ferry Farm.
We are open every day except for some holidays. You guys can come to Ferry Farm for a guided house tour of the replica of the Washington House. You don't have to worry about touching the walls or touching the furniture. Everything is interactive. You get to interact with your guide and ask them questions as you go through the house, but you get to also interact with the furniture and the ceramics and the silverware on the table. You can go through the drawers and the escritoire, the big desk in the dining room. We keep lots of things hidden in there, lots of little toys and games and trinkets. A lot of the times, if the weather's good, our guides will open up the front door to the house, and it is a beautiful view. You get a really great view of the city of Fredericksburg, and you can really see fully across the river and just get a sense of what the landscape looked like when George was here. And if you don't have time to do a full house tour, you can also just walk around the grounds. We have a path that leads down to the Rappahannock River, and you can see the house from the front. A lot of people don't realize that the Washington House's front side actually faces the river, and it's not the side that you walk up on. And we also have some active archaeological sites, so we dig for about 3 months out of the year. If you come during the summer months, you might be able to visit our archaeologists and see what they're digging up. We also have a visitor center, which gives you a peek inside of our archaeology lab, so you can see them working to mend artifacts as well as wash artifacts.
We also have a couple of artifacts that we don't usually have on display that could relate to Washington directly. A pair of Talio cufflinks that have a little fox on them. It represents fox hunting, and George was a big fan of that. We also have a Masonic pipe bowl, which is very interesting. We know George was a Mason, so it could have belonged to him.
The site has gone through a lot over the years. The George Washington Foundation acquired the site in the 1990s after Walmart wanted to develop the site and put a location here, but local community members stepped in and saved the property, and the foundation was able to step in and get the property for themselves.
There was a series of efforts to save the property throughout the 20th century that were largely unsuccessful until the 1990s, when the property was threatened by development. The question of what to do with the land was open until the 1990s again, when the people trying to save the property developed a plan to conduct a large-scale archaeological excavation and then perfect the landscape as it looked as the Washingtons knew it.
Whenever we have events, there's still people that come up to me and say, I helped with that protest. I have signs. So it's still very much, in people's minds. And even one of our staff was a large part of the effort to save Ferry Farm.
And they do. They just say, I saved Ferry Farm.
Yeah.
And that's great. The fact that they have to sort of buy into this place even 30 years later is incredibly rewarding.
So archaeological work started in the early 2000s. At that point, we had a visitor center, but it was basically just flat land. There was nothing on the landscape. After a few years, we managed to find the foundation of the Washington House, which was a huge discovery. It was an incredible process to really go through all the documentation that we have, which is quite limited, as well as the archaeological evidence to reconstruct the house that you guys see today. There are a few documents that were incredibly helpful in the effort to interpret the house. Such as Augustine Washington's probate inventory, which basically gave us a step-by-step checklist on what needs to be in each room. But there are a lot of documents that just don't exist that would be really helpful and telling the story about what Ferry Farm looked like during the Washington's occupation.
The story of George and the Cherry Tree can be traced back to an early amateur biographer of Washington named Parson Weems. The thrust of the story is that George tells the truth, and the dad is so thankful that he's told the truth that he forgives him for chopping down the tree.
And it's allegory. You know, these are tales meant to illustrate morality for children. And then in the 1830s becomes part of children's books, their curriculum in school. So like all these children across the country are learning these tales. Whenever the Union soldiers come here during the Civil War, we know that's on their minds because they're doing things like carving off pieces of trees that they think are cherry trees and sending them home. In one instance, a little lead axe about this big, or a hatchet, that a Civil War soldier carved the mold out of wood and then melted mini balls and made that little hatchet because he's thinking of George chopping down the cherry tree. That's one of my favorite artifacts. Some of the families that lived here in the 19th century and 20th century, they would, people would come and visit and want to learn about George Washington's boyhood home, and they would sell pieces of wood that they said were from the cherry tree. So there are lots of people in Fredericksburg that have little bits of the cherry tree.
When he gets here at 6, the family is sort of idyllic, and that stays that way until George turns 11 when his father dies. And then his life, family's life, and the enslaved people's lives change dramatically. The will of Augustine Washington, George's father, follows 18th century tradition. The largest percentage of his land holdings and his economic interests are transferred out of the family to his 2 sons from a previous marriage. At that point, Mary Washington has a decision to make. She can either try and make a successful match, which in the 18th century means marrying somebody who is of the wealth and status that she's been enjoying for her adult life up until this point, or she can choose widowhood. She chooses widowhood. The death of George's father is incredibly traumatic for everybody that lives on this farm.
Mary Washington exhibits a lot of strength during this time period. She is running the household on her own, and she's making choices that are going to eventually end, with her children becoming who they are. And she was very successful with most of them. So a big part of this site is Mary after Augustine dies, because it's her show.
I definitely love the story of George Washington and all of the formative years that he spent here. But I think what fascinates me the most is the story of Mary, how she had faced hardship from early on in her life. She became an orphan, and then she eventually married Augustine and had her children. But then he passes away and leaves her with 5 children to raise on her own. And she is faced with a difficult decision. She chooses to not get remarried, and she stays single for the rest of her life. And she faces a lot of challenges because of that, but she also is incredibly successful in raising her 5 children to become members of the gentry class. Because she made this decision, this is kind of how George ended up where he was. And I think that is a really special story that we get to tell here.
The excavation has been ongoing for about 22 years.
Which is huge.
Which is, yes, huge in archaeological times. And we've uncovered a lot of things that relate to the Washington family and their enslaved workers. But we have lots and lots left to find. We're in the process of uncovering the remains of a colonial kitchen that stood while the Washingtons were here. And that building has both a horrific story and a great preservation story for us. The horrific part is that it catches on fire around the 1740. Archaeologically, it's the opposite. It's a preserved archaeological site like Pompeii, where everything is stuck in place when the catastrophe occurs. Everything that was on the floor of that kitchen cellar will still be there. Now, it will be broken and burned, but it is still there. And so as we uncover that, we will recover sort of a stuck-in-time moment in the Washingtons' lives, at least as far as the kitchen is concerned.
For me, the coolest thing that we've found here is glue, believe it or not. Nobody ever expects that answer. But whenever I first started working here about 11 years ago, I noticed that some of the ceramics that were, belonged to Mary Washington that she had purchased herself had evidence of being broken and repaired using historic glues. We have about 8 vessels at this point, and we did all sorts of tests. We ran it through a mass spectrometer. We reproduced 18th century glues from old recipes. We broke ceramics that we got at thrift stores and mended them with the glues that we had made. What we learned is that most of these glues were very strong. They absolutely could hold a broken pot together, but they didn't hold water. The most famous vessel we have that has glue on it is a cherry punch bowl that's about this big. It has cherries painted on it. Very fashionable. Mary would have wanted people to see that she owned it, which was important. Once it broke, she had one of her enslaved make a glue, repair it, and then she could put it on the wall, maybe turn the crack to the wall, or put it in her china cabinet to fill out her cabinet. And it didn't matter that she couldn't use it. What matters was that people saw that she owned it.
My biggest surprise from the archaeology here is just how effective archaeology is at uncovering the systems that the Washingtons and their enslaved community put into place after the death of Augustine Washington. One of the things that really reveals is just how badly early 20th century and even later 20th century biographers miss on Mary Washington.
Mm-hmm.
The archaeology indicates that she is incredibly fashionable and fashion conscious. She's well dressed, her house is well equipped, and she's using her material culture to try and reinforce her gentry status, making her an incredibly sophisticated person. The other thing that biographers get is they sort of talk about her being sort of crude and illiterate. And part of that is because they don't understand the 18th century very well. They talk about her handwriting being poor and that she doesn't spell very well. Well, that's just part of the 18th century.
Nobody could spell well.
Nobody could do any of that stuff. But they ignore the fact that she writes letters and that she has a library. He follows some of the greatest religious thinkers of the 18th century. She has their books and she reads them and she reinforces those with her children. All of that is missed by biographers of Mary Washington.
There's tons of opportunities daily, but we also have special events. We always have something for 4th of July and for George Washington's birthday in February. So there's tons of things that you can come out and do all the time here at Ferry Farm.